Okay, so here's a study question, what I think I'll do is during the break I'll send these to you. I'll just, yeah. So, yeah. So it's this. This is a big question, actually, and the issue of a huge debate ongoing in philosophy of mind these days, and that kind of overflows into the sciences. I've had some encounters with scientists about this issue. Does an explanation of consciousness necessarily have to be representational? This comes out of, I would say, the West Coast interpretation of the nomadic element, that they tend to think of it, yes, as representational. So one of the people on the West Coast who sort of buys this interpretation of Husserl is Hubert Dreyfus, right? But he's a staunch anti-representationalist, so he doesn't actually like Husserl. So he rejects Husserl because he thinks Husserl, has this representationalism involved, and that's what the noema is. We were talking about the percept yesterday. I mean, is a percept just a representation? Is that the way one would conceive it? And if we think of perception, for example, in terms of affordances, then perceiving, this means something like perceiving things in a kind of action-oriented or pragmatic way in terms of how we are related to these things. And this is consistent, by the way, with Husserl's own work. He talked about the I can. I perceive the world in terms of what I can do in regard to the object, which you can trace through phenomenology into Merleau-Ponty. And it was Gibson who read Merleau-Ponty, and I think was influenced somewhat by Merleau-Ponty to come up with this really nice concept of affordances. Does that change the way that we think about the brain? Right? If we're trying to think of, what is a percept in the brain? What are the neural correlates of a percept, or whatever that question was yesterday? If we're thinking of that as a representation, then that seems to imply that the brain works in a certain way. But if we think about this more in terms of affordances and more in terms of embodied cognition, does that actually change the way we have to think about what the brain is doing? So I'll leave that for you to solve.
Can I ask a question? I can't stop thinking about how you regard this phosphine phenomena.
The
phosphine, which you can induce by TMS or electrical stimulation of the visual cortex. There's nothing like phosphine object outside, and there seems to be no affordance, but it's so vivid you can experience it. It's really easy, and I'm pretty sure Husserl or nobody, Merleau-Ponty knew about this kind of thing can be induced really easily. So this is a kind of phenomena that needs to be addressed in contemporary phenomenologists. Is it considered to be a percept, or do you just ignore this?
Yeah, so there is a philosopher, Gareth Evans, he's a British analytic philosopher who talks about phosphenes in an attempt to solve the Molyneux problem, which is an old problem in philosophy about whether a blind man can see after having sight restored to him. That's the only discussion of phosphenes I know in the philosophical literature, but there probably is more recent stuff if it is a topic in science. But I'm not quite, So you could induce phosphenes by stimulating the visual cortex, I imagine. And then you have an experience.
Right.
And then we could say that there's a phenomenality to that experience. There's an intentionality to it as well, because we're aware of a phosphene, or whatever that is. How are we aware of what does that look like?
Just like white blob or some kind of white flash, or something really fluffy.
Yeah.
Sometimes depending on your stimulation site, it could be moving.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, let's say that if we go with the affordance idea, and then I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, in most of our perceptions and encounters with the world, right? We're dealing with them in this kind of affordance structure, but then there might be some kind of exceptions where, which are interesting to think about, right? But It might be that we then have to think about those things that seem somewhat meaningless. I mean, if just see a white blob, that, what's the meaning there? What are we intentionally related to? And what kind of affordance does it give us? Maybe none. Maybe the affordance level just drops to 0 or something like that. But I think that's a really good problem to think about. I'm not quite sure how to respond to it. It seems to me, however, that you could still use some of this kind of approach to talk about it, and then to try to sort out what all that might mean. Okay, so that's intentionality, at least giving you a kind of sense of the kind of terminology and the kind of discussion you find in phenomenology about intentionality. I want to talk about pre-reflective self-awareness, and I'll start by talking about reflection itself. So the intentionality of consciousness is found in a kind of first-order level of experience. Right? I just open my eyes and I see something, for example. And there's no reflection involved at that level. Right? I'm just seeing the tree. But then, of course, I always have the option of the opportunity to reflect on what it is that is going on with me in terms of what I'm seeing and so forth. So I can always take up a certain perspective, one order removed, so to speak, where I kind of stand back and I look at my own experience. One order removed from the immediate experience of seeing the tree. So I might suddenly discover that I hate that apple tree. And I can then reflect on this hating, and then that can become an explicit sort of awareness that I am hating rather than liking or planning something or whatever. So this reflective move is a kind of stepping back and taking a look at our own experience, making the experience the object, the intentional object of our consciousness. So maybe the noetic aspect is even more complex. It's not just perceiving, but I kind of perceive the tree and I hate it, and I'm planning to do something about that tree. So I could start to reflect about all of this, and that adds another layer, another complexity to consciousness. So the intentional object of reflection in such cases would be the noetic aspects of the first order consciousness. I would take those aspects, or that consciousness itself, to be the object of my reflection. Yep.
So you see the intentionality in the first order level of experience. So how could you prove it or explain it? So there's no passive consciousness.
There's no consequences of what? Reflection?
So in the first sentence, intentionality of consciousness on the first order level experience. So I don't feel quite that comfortable with that statement.
So which statement are you talking about? The I am conscious of something?
The intentionality.
This one here, the intentionality of consciousness, is found on the first order level of experience? Yeah, so what I mean by that is simply that I can have a perceptual experience, for example. It just, without any kind of complication. Of course, I'm not talking about subpersonal complications. There are, of course, all kinds of processes going on in the brain, in order to get this. But in terms of the phenomenology, in terms of my experience, this is just a kind of straightforward experience of something that could happen. And then what I'm just trying to contrast that with is this kind of looping back that I could engage in order to take that first order. If you don't like the word first, you just say one level, and that this reflection is a second level thing that takes the first level as its object.
Can I just?
Yep.
I think he first said that first statement suggests that there's no consciousness that is passive I think that's what he suggested in the beginning. So I
Right.
think there was confusion between the term intentionality and intention in that case. So if you understand intentionality in terms of intention, it seems to suggest that all consciousness is active in the sense of involving
Right.
intention. So I think it might help to clarify
Active versus passive.
well, the difference between intentionality and intention.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so there is one distinction to make is between intentionality in this broad sense that phenomenologists are using this. It really has to do with the kind of the experience of meaning of the world and so forth, as opposed to intention, which is usually associated with action, willing to do something, drawing up a certain prior intention or plan to do a certain action, right? So one can sort of distinguish those two. But the phenomenologist would also say that that whole process of forming an intention, planning out some action, that also is characterizable in terms of intentionality in the first sense, right? So intentionality is a broader concept which would include the notion of intention, which is more active, right? So if that's a way to conceive of the relationship of these two.
If you moving into a different area, it's always tricky to get the concepts, to really get a grip of what the concepts mean. Would it be possible to replace intentionality by directionality? That every consciousness has a direction, and that is different from set theory. Set theory, a collection of things that have a direction. That is what Hayatan meant, that maybe a mathematics which has based on error points, etc.
Yeah. So I have that term directionality up there in the beginning, right? Intentionality is a kind of directionality towards something. If you want to think of it that way, that's fine.
The use of the word layers to me kind of suggests that
Level.
levels, yeah. Perhaps suggests that all of these can happen at the same time.
Yeah.
While
I can be seeing the tree and reflecting on the fact that I'm seeing the tree.
Right, but the way it's written here, it seems to me that this is more of a process a little bit, right? Perhaps that's kind of the first thing that emerges is this first level.
Yeah.
And some later time in a different, what I would say is a different quale or a different perceptual state, you're at 2, and then you're at a different perceptual state.
Yeah, so the reflection has to have something already kind of there to reflect upon. So one might think that, this first level, if we want to use that terminology, it might not be the best, but that first level of experience is already kind of happening.
Sure.
And then I have the possibility of reflecting on it. If that's not happening, then I'm not quite sure what I'm reflecting on.
Maybe it's related to Ken's question and also his question as well. It seems to me it's kind of weird to assume always there is some kind of intentionality or directiveness in any experience we have. Like usual example is a boredom or tiredness or something that it doesn't seem to refer to anything outside or even inside. I don't know.
Yeah.
In the case of boredom, it doesn't talk about my bodily state or anything, right? So I'm not really sure whether this has to be true for any conscious experience.
Yeah, so I think mood might even be a better, because boredom, you can be bored about something, or something's boring you, right? So that can have an intentionality to it. Mood seems more disparate, but one could say, my mood is about something. I might not know what it is that it's about. It might be just about the world in general. People talk about anxiety as not having an object. It's just a kind of angst that isn't directed towards something. So there might be exceptions that one would say, oh, they're kind of non-intentional. But then once we sort of start reflecting on those things, then there is a kind of intentionality introduced. But maybe on that first order level, it's not clear what the intentionality is.
So that kind of thing could be self-order, so even having no intentionality possible.
Husserl actually thinks there are certain non-intentional aspects of consciousness, and we'll talk about some of those later on today. But some people argue that pain is like that.